Hello, welcome. I have brown hair. So some things have changed in the last few weeks, aside from like the obvious if you've been watching my vlog. I dyed my hair. Was it potentially a mental breakdown? Who can tell? I am filming a little bit later in the day, so I'm hoping the lighting and the setup is okay because it is a little darker than I would normally be filming in, but it's winter in Australia and the hours of the day that there are sun are few and far between. So we have to make do with what we have. At the start of the year, I made a video about books that I thought were underrated or not talked about enough, but books that are absolutely fabulous and you need to add to your TBR. However, we are now halfway through the year. Also, don't look at that. We are now halfway through the year. How the heck did we get halfway through the year? No idea, but we're halfway through the year. So I thought it would be prime time to do another video of some like underrated hidden gems, just kind of books that I don't really hear people talking about as often. And for some of these books, they may be ones that you've heard of before. They're not like unknown books by any means, but they're just the ones that I feel I don't hear about on like YouTube or TikTok or whatever, as much as I hear about like My Year of Rest and Relaxation and all those big ones that everyone talks about. So I'm wanting to try and make a video where hopefully, fingers crossed, there are a couple of books in here that you have not heard of before. But before we fully get into the video, please, if you have a minute, take the time to like, subscribe, leave a comment. I'm getting so close to 700 subscribers at the time that I'm filming this video, which is very exciting. And I would love to hit like 700 maybe before my birthday. My birthday's in like 3 weeks, guys. That could be your birthday present to me, and it's free. Just give the video a like. Okay, so enough what's the word? Enough advertising, enough self-promo. Let's get into the books. Okay, so the first book, as I said, these are not like unknown books that you've never heard of, but they are books that I rarely hear people talking about, and that is, the first one is going to be A Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion. And I know what you're going to say. Joan Didion is an incredibly well-known author. Everyone knows the name Joan Didion. However, I so rarely hear people talking about this as like a must read, and I do honestly believe it is a must read. So this is a non-fiction, which is also something that I rarely recommend because I rarely read non-fiction, but this is a non-fiction autobiographical memoir that Joan Didion wrote during a year where her daughter Quintana had been admitted to the ICU for a brain aneurysm, I believe, and her husband John passed away, all in like a super short space of time. So it's basically a very short autobiographical novel about grief and loss and love and the different types of love. The reason that I think this is such an underrated classic is because the way, obviously Joan Didion is an absolutely phenomenal writer, but the way she writes about loss is just so beautiful and so stunning and so normal, I guess would be the right word. I feel like sometimes when grief is described in novels or fiction stories, it's described as this huge, overwhelming thing, and characters go catatonic and stay in bed for 3-4 weeks and can't get up and blah, blah, blah. And that is definitely a facet of grief. That is certainly one way that people cope with grief. But as someone who has recently gone through an event in my life that has caused a lot of grief, who also has a job and a YouTube channel and friends and family, and I don't have rich parents that can just pay my life. Part of what Joan Didion talks about in this book is how life continues, and even though the most horrible thing that you could possibly think of has just happened to you, the world goes on, and you look around you and you want to scream at people like, how can you just act so normal? Don't you know that this awful thing has happened? But Joan Didion talks about the way that you just have to work out how to keep going. You just have to find the passages through your everyday life that allow you to get through the day. There is one quote in this book, which I think is probably the most kind of like quoted part of the book, the most kind of like famous part of this book, which is when Joan is talking about the moment that her husband John passes away. She describes it as life changes in the instant, the ordinary instant. And I don't know what it was about that singular kind of sentence that really struck me because it is so true. Often people pass away from really awful diseases and it's horrible and it's long and drawn out, but so often people just pass, people just die, people just leave, people just change their mind, and there's not necessarily some great cosmic event that leads to that. It's just a moment. From memory, Joan's husband John passes away while she's making their meal for dinner, and he's sitting at the dining room table reading his newspaper, and she turns around and he's passed away. And I think that it's just such a beautiful meditation on not taking life for granted and not taking the people in your life for granted and not letting grief consume you and not letting the terror of losing someone consume you, but also understanding that life changes in an ordinary instant. Your life could change in 2 seconds flat, so don't take what you have for granted. Don't take the people in your life that you have for granted. This is definitely a heavy read. I actually started reading this last year when I was going through some traumatic point in my life, and I had to sort of stop reading it because I was like, oh, this one might hit a bit too close to the heart. But if you are someone who maybe has enough distance from a grief event in your life and you are interested in reading some more about I love authors that describe everyday human emotions in just the most stunning, beautiful ways. And Joan Didion has done an absolutely spectacular job of this. It's moving, it's real, it's biting. She brings you into her inner world in a really, truly, deeply, beautifully personal way, and I just cannot recommend this one enough. And I wish more people talked about it. More people need to be talking about Joan Didion. Get on it. The next book I want to talk about is one that I never hear people talking about, and that may be a combination of the fact that it is an Australian novel and it is also an older novel, so I do apologize if you're someone not living in Australia and you want to find this book and you can't. Surely I will check before I put this video out. Surely it has to be on Amazon. Not that I would ever recommend that. Go to your local bookstore first, go to your library, but worst comes to worst, Amazon, and that is The Natural Way of Things by Charlotte Wood. So this is the reason that I think so many people would like this, and the reason that I can't believe this is slept on, is the fact that it is so similar to the plot of I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman. I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman. It's up there. So basically the plot of this novel is two women wake up and they are imprisoned with I think 8 or 10 other women. They have had their heads shaved. They are trapped out in the desert with these jailers and they have no idea why they're there. They're kept under a lock and key. And by talking to each other while they're being made to do physical labor, they realize that the one thing they have in common is they all have been involved in a big sexual scandal with a very powerful man. However, as time progresses and the food starts running out and the jailers themselves, who are men, don't know what's going on, the women and the men who are their jailers realize that they are actually stuck in this mess together. This is kind of like a dystopian science fiction-y, but it's an Australian contemporary novel. It's so brilliant, and I feel like it will really change your perspective on womanhood and what it is to be a woman in contemporary society. It's full of this kind of bristling, boiling, underlying rage that is shot through in every page. And now that I'm talking about this, I actually think I'm going to give this a reread because I haven't read this for a very long time and I love it and it's so beautiful. I did actually learn through doing some research on this book before I picked it up to do this video that it is actually based on a real school. So it's actually based on the Hay Institution for Girls, which is an offshoot of Parramatta Girls' Home that was reserved for the 10 worst offenders in the state in the 1960s and 70s. They were drugged and put on a train to the decommissioned men's prison in the southwest of New South Wales, where they were forced to march, look at the floor, never talk to each other, and endure sexual violence, which is a really horrific part of Australia's history that I didn't know about until I started doing my notes for this video. I think any woman who is reading this will distinctly relate to the nightmare scenario of being drugged and waking up in a place that you don't know, surrounded by people, particularly men that you may not know, and being violated in a way that is not necessarily, I mean, obviously the women in this book have also been sexually violated, but by the jailers themselves. They're not I don't know how to say what I'm trying to say. The power dynamics of being a woman trapped with men that you don't know and you don't know if you can trust. There is something terrifying about that I think any woman watching this video would relate to. And there is a certain feeling of hopelessness that comes with being trapped in a situation like that. There are not a lot of books that do a really good job of capturing misogyny and women's rage in both a realistic but also contemporary way. I feel like there are so many books like Handmaid's Tale or I Who Have Never Known Men who capture it in a very like futuristic what if kind of way. I feel like this is written in a meant to be taken literally kind of way. The way that this is written is so perfectly controlled that it never kind of slips into that concept of like a moment that you can't believe. It's a very believable story, which, you know, with everything that's going on in the world right now is becoming more and more believable by the day, which is terrifying. I love a book that sticks with you when you read it, and I feel like the fact that I read this book so long ago shows that it does just that. It really kind of gets under your skin and burrows into your heart and stays with you. I am actually going to probably finish filming this video and go start a reread of this book because I loved it so much, and talking about it and thinking about it and writing my notes on it reminded me of how much I love it and how much I want to be engrossed in this novel again. So again, I do apologize if you're not able to find this one, but I would really highly recommend you try at least to find it. That is The Natural Way of Things by Charlotte Wood. So a newer one that hopefully will be a bit easier for you to find, but that is Sugar Baby by Celine St. Clair. This is about our main character Agnes, who has just turned 21. She's living in, I don't think it's kind of like a housing commission. I don't know what you call that in other countries, but like government housing in a small suburb in England. She lives with her mother, who is a cleaner and very highly religious. Agnes, through like happenstance circumstances, manages to fall into the world of sex work and sugaring, and she goes from very quickly being like a impoverished young girl under the thumb of her overly religious mother to living independently in the big city, making her own money. In the current age that we live in with social media, as fantastic as it is at destigmatizing sex work, because let's be so for real, sex work is real work, but I do think that often the darker side of sex work is not portrayed in an accurate way. I do think sometimes sex work is glamorized in a way that it shouldn't be, and lots of influencers and creators aren't necessarily honest about the darker sides of the industry. I think this book does an excellent job of kind of balancing the fact that yes, it does have some like really big pros about it, but also it has some really dark sides, and it can do some really damaging things to your self-esteem if you don't enter the industry with a really good lock on who you are as a person. I also think it does a really beautiful job at talking about wealth disparity and what it is to exist in the world as someone who relies on their job, as someone who doesn't have a safety net. Anyone watching this video will understand what it's like to have a job and to have to work for money, but I also think there's a big difference in moving to the big smoke and trying to make your own life and make your own way at it while also knowing that you have the safety net of a family system to fall back on. Agnes doesn't have that. Her mother is not only not wealthy, but she's highly religious, and Agnes kind of knows that if she goes home and her mum finds out what she's been doing, she will basically be like excommunicated by the family. This, I believe, was Celine St. Clair's debut novel, and I think she does a really fantastic job. Some of the debut novels coming out of female authors in particular are just so absolutely stunning. It just goes to show that the publishing industry really needs to like get a lock on having some more diverse authors under their sleeves. What am I saying? But this book is beautiful. It also has some really wonderful things to say about race and the way women of certain colors are fetishized by men or just by society in general. I also think this book is very funny and does a very good job at nailing the kind of zillennial Gen Z way of speaking that Agnes has without trying to make it satire or trying to make fun of the character. It's all done very tongue-in-cheek, very like holding the hand of reader and bringing you along for the ride with Agnes rather than trying to like make fun of Agnes. So if you're looking for something that's a little bit easier of a read, like it is quite thick, but the font size on my edition is very large, which is actually a pet peeve of mine. That would be Sugar Baby by Celine St. Clair. Okay, so the next one, I need you to just bear with me for a minute while I introduce it, because I know exactly what you're going to say. I'm going to talk about Penance by Eliza Clark, and I realize that Eliza Clark is an incredibly well-known author on like the BookTok, BookTube community. However, whenever I hear people talking about Eliza Clark, I always hear people talking about Boy Parts. And yes, that book is incredible. It's one of my all-time favorite novels. However, I think Eliza Clark, with her second novel, Penance, stepped out of the box of what everyone was expecting her to write. Penance is a kind of like autobiographical style, almost memoir, true crime novel, which I don't think anyone expected her to write after what Boy Parts was. And I really don't hear people talking about this novel as much as they should, because it's excellent. So this book is a fiction true crime book written in the style of a non-fiction true crime book, if that makes sense. Just bear with me. So we talk about a group of teenage girls who actually brutally torture and set fire to one of their classmates. So essentially the fictitious true crime author within this book is going through interviews with the girls and their personal diaries and newspaper articles from the crime, and like piecing together a kind of blow by blow memoir in the lead up to Joan's death. And this book is set almost 10 years after the events that the book talks about. So obviously it's very meta. The author within the story of the book, not Eliza Clark, is getting to talk to the girls in retrospect when they've been in prison for some time and have had time to think about what they did. However, without spoiling the end of the book, this book has one of my favorite writing tropes, that's not the right word, writing thingy-mabobbies, I can't think of the word, which is an unreliable narrator. So we do find out partway through this book that the author within the book, he's actually kind of been like excommunicated by the true crime community due to some like dubious journalistic tactics that he'd used for one of his last jobs. But this is harrowing. It is deeply upsetting. I think anyone who has ever been a teenage girl in high school can contest to the fact that it is such an accurate portrayal of what teenage girls are like and how fucking vicious they can be. I was someone who was not particularly popular in school. I was bullied by, lots of like the popular girls, and I can definitely contest that the way they come after you, particularly, this includes a lot of like Tumblr lore, particularly the way that online presence plays such a big role in contemporary bullying and how that is carried out in today's society, is just so accurate. I think Eliza Clark has done an absolutely phenomenal job of summing up the paradox of what it is to be a teenage girl and how brutal being a girl is, but also how brutal a girl can be. And I so rarely hear people talking about this book when I hear the name Eliza Clark mentioned. So if you are someone who has read Boy Parts and enjoyed Boy Parts, I would seriously recommend you check this one out. I think a lot of people get turned off it because of the whole true crime aspect, but I promise you it is still an incredible study of character, just like Boy Parts, an incredible study into the sociopathic nature of what it is to be a woman. Just give it a chance. Just trust me on this one. All right, the last book I want to talk about is a super duper recent one by a kind of, favorite of the channel, and that is the Book of X by Sarah Rose Edda. Sarah Rose Edda is, as you can probably see from the annoying sticker, don't want it on there. Anyway, this is the Book of X by Sarah Rose Edda, who is the author of Ripe, which is another book that I've spoken at length on this channel about. So this is a book about our main character, Cassie. The world that this book is set in is kind of like a surrealist take on our current contemporary society. So our main character, Cassie, lives on a farm in what is called a meat quarry, which is quite literally what it sounds like. The men in her family have for years mined the earth for meat. So it's kind of like gold. The family has a nose for sniffing out the veins of meat, and they've built their fortune off mining meat from the ground. And the way it's described in the books when Cassie does go to visit the quarry is just as disgusting and visceral and gag worthy as you would expect, like the smells and the feel and the sound and the color. What makes Cassie different, and what makes all the women in Cassie's family different, is the fact that all of the women in Cassie's family, for as long as they can remember, have been born with literal like knots in their abdomen. So their whole abdomen from when they were born is tied into a knot. Now I think, personally, I think this is an absolutely stunning and incredibly well executed metaphor for generational trauma, particularly the trauma that we as women often have passed on to us by our mothers or our grandmothers. Concept of what we have around our appearance and the comments you hear your mum making about, oh, I look fat in this dress, that you internalize and take on yourself. I think this is just such a clever way of, in my opinion, you could read it and think I'm completely full of shit. I think this is just such a stunning way of portraying that and talking about how, without even realizing, the scars that you hold and the negative opinions you have of yourself can often subconsciously be transferred to the people around you, especially if you're not careful about what you say. So throughout the novel, we meet Cassie when she's a young girl trying to fit into a world that really doesn't let her fit in because of her obvious physical differences. She's trying to work out how to interact with boys and what is, you know, consent and what is important, and already trying to grapple with the incredible pressures that are put on young women to look a certain way while she has this like obvious, very different physical deformity. We then follow Cassie into adulthood when she has moved away from the meat quarry into the big city and is trying to contend with all of the same issues that she had as a child, but now as an adult. I also think this is a beautiful way of talking about how you can, as the great Hannah Montana once said, you can change your hair and you can change your clothes, but you'll always find your way back home. Which, you know, now I'm saying it, could be a song about generational trauma. You can change your hair and clothes, but if what is inside has not been changed, if you haven't learnt to, this is now sounding like an after show special. If you haven't learnt to be okay with what's in here, no amount of changing on the outside is going to change the person you are inside. Unhappiness is something that you carry within you and cannot be changed by a change of hair color or losing weight. And that is something that is really viciously put in the reader's face when Cassie tries to deal with this deformity in her body and finds that she is still unhappy and is still the same person that she was prior to getting the surgery to fix the knot. I don't feel like that's a spoiler. It does happen like midway through the book, but I feel like you kind of get the sense of that's where it's going. But yeah, it's a beautiful meditation on body image and self-consciousness and self-love and family ties, and, as I said, generational trauma and what it is to try and break that generational trauma as an adult, and the way that attempting to break out of that framework can often be what breaks you as an adult. I was so excited when I knew that Sarah Rose Etter was writing a second book because, as I said, I absolutely loved Ripe, and I loved the way that the character in Ripe also, I felt like, grappled with a lot of the same things that Cassie does, but just in a very different way. But yeah, this is just such a beautiful book, and I was so very, very pleased that it was just as good as her debut novel. So definitely give this one a check out. I've lost my ability to speak. So this video is probably going to be a little bit of a shorter one. As I said, we are midway through the year. How are we halfway through the year? And I just thought it would be the perfect time to do another check-in with you and give you some suggestions for books that I just don't see people talking about as often, and I think should be talked about as often. So if you are intending on adding any of these books to your TBR, or if you've read any of them and had opinions, whether the same or different, let me know. As usual, I love to have a little chat with you all in the comments. I am currently midway through a script for a video that is melting my brain for good and the bad. I think I'm getting brain rot and have lost probably a large proportion of my brain cells from trying to make this video. So when it comes out in a couple of weeks, you all better like it, because if you don't, there's not really a whole lot I can do about it. I hope you're all having fantastic weeks, fantastic months, fantastic years, halfway through the year. I need to go get my nails fixed so badly. Please don't look at them. I say that as I keep pointing them out. As usual, don't forget to like, subscribe, don't leave a mean comment or I will cry, and I will see you in next week's video. Bye. Mwah.